using type to thrive in a complex world. And it's a nice job, it's a nice title, I think, for a presentation, because our world is increasingly complex. In fact, when I talked initially to Charles and Ruth about putting this session together, we'd already hit on this sort of title, but that was actually before COVID. And since then, I think things have got even more complex and complicated. Because before COVID, we already lived in a world which was complicated. And some of you may have heard the acronym VUCA before. Quick show of hands. This is your first little bit of interactivity in this session. Quick show of hands if you've heard of this acronym VUCA before. Some of you, not all of you. VUCA stands for, first of all, volatile. Things are changeable, things are changing all the time. Things are uncertain, we're not quite sure how they're going to change, and they're changing in complicated and complex ways. Increasingly, everything is connected with everything else, and that makes life more complicated and makes things more ambiguous as well. And well before COVID, for the last several years, people have talked about the world of work and life generally as becoming more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think the advent of COVID makes things even more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And things have changed in unexpected ways. So to take one obvious example, many people have suddenly had to change from working in an office to working at home. So let's just have a quick check about where you are in relation to this particular question. So let's see which of these best describes your particular work status. So let's just have a quick show of hands. If you'd like to put up your hands if that first line refers to you. I was already working remotely before the pandemic and have continued to do so. Anybody? Yep. One or two of you. What about the second one? I've transitioned and now remote workers. Perhaps you were in an office, but now we're working remotely. Yeah, one or two of you. You are still working, but actually you're not working remotely. You are going to an office or some place of work. I suspect not many of you, in fact, none of you. The last one, so perhaps you're not in employment at the moment, or you're retired, or you're a homemaker, or you're a student, or just unemployed. So quite a few of you. So a range of different answers from you there. But what we're finding is obviously many people were used to working in an office, and that has affected them in various ways. And one of the ways in which you may have affected them is about the extent to which they're anxious about what's happening in the world. And David, if you'd like to launch that poll now, what we're going to be doing is ask you a question. We're doing it as a poll so that it'll be anonymous. And you should see that poll have appeared on your screen. It should say, I am more anxious than usual. Do you strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree with that question? If you'd like to choose your option now and press submit, and again, this is one question we're going to do anonymously because I'm aware that you may not want people to know how anxious or wise you are. So if you'd like to choose your option now. David, are the answers coming in? They are. So when you feel we have quite a few answers, or when people have had a chance to choose their option, if you'd like to display the results. Okay, so it looks like nobody strongly agrees, but just over half of you, 56% agree, with little under half strongly disagreeing or disagree. Okay, so it looks as if many of you do feel you're a little more anxious than usual. If you want to remove that poll from your screen, just click on the close button and it should vanish as if it was never there. Now, we actually asked this question, along with many other questions, in a research survey that we've actually been carrying out since the start of May this year. And to show you the answer to this question, we split the group into remote workers and those who didn't work remotely. And when we looked at the people who were remote workers in our survey, there was an even split. Half the group disagreed or strongly disagreed, and half agreed or strongly agreed. But with those who were in a job but who weren't working remotely, it was very much a different story. Only 30% disagreed or strongly disagreed, but 70% did feel that they were more anxious than usual. And what's more, those levels of anxiety have risen over time. The average score of this question amongst remote workers who completed the survey later on wasn't much higher than the average score for those who completed it back in May. But the average level of anxiety for non-remote workers is definitely increasing over time. This data, by the way, dates to September this year. We're going to do a data download soon because this survey is still ongoing. So we live at times which are at best interesting, but for many people, stressful. Those day-to-day effects of COVID can be stressful. Lockdowns, shortages, what we've just heard in the news recently, wearing a mask, going to the shops and forget you haven't got your mask with you, all those things can cause day-to-day stress. Those of you who are self-employed may have experienced a direct hit on their income. Other people have been furloughed or working reduced hours or been made redundant or haven't been made redundant yet, but very worried about whether their job is secure or not. Or perhaps they still have a job, but feel guilty that they still have that job when other people don't. Some people who've already lost their jobs may be thinking about going it alone, starting their own business or becoming gig workers. So how can a knowledge of type help these people adapt and make the most of their gifts? And now that so many people are working remotely, how can type help with this? Like, how can remote workers and others avoid the trap of the always-on culture, whereby they are always connected and become stressed as a result? And last but certainly not least, how can a knowledge of type just help people to increase their well-being in this stressful time? Now, to answer some of those questions, we're going to draw on the results of a number of different research projects that we've carried out in the Myers-Briggs company. We're going to look at some research that's still ongoing about people's reactions to COVID-19 and the effects of that and how this relates to their personality type. We're going to look at work looking at personality and whether people are entrepreneurs or gig workers and how this might relate to how well they work in those jobs. We're going to look at the always-on culture. How does your personality type relate to the extent to which you feel yourself pulled into that always-on culture or not? And last but not least, looking at well-being at work. What can personality say about what techniques might work best for you or best for other people you're working with to increase their well-being in this stressful time? But although this is based on research, this isn't purely a research presentation. Very much the idea is we're going to draw the findings. And I don't intend to go to lots of stats. Happy to go into that with individual people, but not perhaps today. But for those of you who do like the stats, I give you links to reports and other sources where you can actually find out more detail about these studies. So that's the overall plan for today. Let me just pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to explore so far. Okay, it looks like it's all either really clear or I've stood you all into silence. I'm going to hope it's a formal one and press on with the presentation. By the way, do excuse me if occasionally I look over here, because I've got two screens and I've got slides, various bits and pieces. Sometimes I'm moving your faces around on my computer. So do forgive me if I occasionally don't look directly at you. But, you know, that's probably a blessed relief. You don't have to look straight at my face all the time. Okay, so we're going to kick off by looking at our research into COVID-19, because since the start of May this year, we've been carrying out a survey into people's perceptions of the crisis and how this relates to their personality type. And we're going to be looking at data from a little over 500 people who completed the online survey up to early September. But as I mentioned, that survey is still running. And in that survey, we asked people about their type, about feelings about the pandemic, about their views about their job, if they had a job, and their main concerns. And one of the things we did was to ask people for 3 words that best describe their feelings about the crisis. And what I'd like you to do is think for yourself about what 3 words you would use to best describe your feelings about the COVID-19 crisis. I'll just give you a moment to do that. And in a moment, David is going to pull you away into a number of different breakout groups. So you'll be one of 3 groups, and you should see in a moment an invite appear on your screen to join one of those groups. And then in your group, I'd like you to discuss and agree on your top 3 words in your group. And I'm going to give you 10 minutes for that session. Okay, so let me ask you then to tell me about your 3 words. Let's go to the first group. Group 1, you should have been labelled as, or, well, actually, just anybody who wants to speak out. Let's have a spokesperson for one group tell us about your 3 words. Over to you.
John, I think we were group 1, so shall I just kick off?
Yep.
Quickly? Most of us, 3 out of the 4 of us, used the word frustrated. That's our first word. Then we had sort of worried or anxious. We went for worried, I think, was the second word.
Okay.
And then, I mean, there were other negative words that were coming up, but a couple of people did feel, you know, a tiny bit hopeful. It's almost like you've got to have something to cling on to. You've got to look for some opportunity, or, you know, something to be hopeful about.
Okay, so frustrated, worried, and hopeful, or there's some opportunity there somewhere. Okay, let's have group 2.
We ended up with disappointed, guilty, and resigned.
Disappointed, guilty, and resigned. Tell me about guilty.
It was a kind of survivor's guilt, because certainly some of us felt that we are very fortunate and we're not suffering terribly. We live in a beautiful place. We can walk outside and we're not suffering from this awful thing as much as so many people.
We'll come on to back on to that a little while, actually. Group 3, what were your 3 words?
I think we were group 3, were we?
Yeah, if you haven't, if your group hasn't been there so far, you're group 3.
I think we had a clutch of negative words of denial, annoyed, and uncomfortable, but we moved to feeling more relaxed because of all the things we didn't have to do.
Okay.
And that moved us into, I think, purposefulness.
Okay.
A way of looking forward and reassessing, trying new things, doing things differently.
Okay. So obviously I split you into 3 groups, and the first group had preferences for thinking. The second group had preferences for introversion and feeling, and the third group had preferences for extroversion and feeling, if I had the groups the right way around. And when we asked the people in our sample, our 532 people, for their 3 words, these are the words which came out as top. And you may not quite be able to read this, depending on if you look at an iPad screen or something, you probably can't read the words, but the most common word was anxious or anxiety, followed by sad or sadness, but then followed by opportunity. So about figuring out, the first group talked about hopefulness, and opportunity perhaps came up. Uncertainty, worried, concerned, then frustrating, and so on and so forth. What we were able to do, in fact, was to put these words into themes using thematic analysis. And if you look at the themes, then it is things around being anxious and concerned and worried, fearful, scared, which came out as the most common theme, uncertain, confused, chaotic, unknown, but then opportunity, hopeful, optimism, and then frustrated, angry, annoyed, irritated, impatient. So you're getting a feel for the source of words that came out. In terms of some of those, the way some of those themes come out, interesting that the first group with a thinking preference came out with frustrated, the other groups didn't, because that was something that came out in analysis, so I haven't done a slide for that. 2 of the slides will show perhaps some of the clearest results. If we look at the theme of anxiety and concern, what you can see there is it tends to be people with an introversion preference who are more likely to use words about anxiety and concern and worrying, especially those types. Whereas if we look at the theme of being more bored or indifferent, which was a theme that some people came up with, it was in particular people who had a dominant function of extroverted sensing, who were more likely to say they feel a bit bored and indifferent about the whole piece, which I think sort of makes sense. As I said, we haven't fully written up these results yet, but we will be producing a nice big chunky report with all these findings in about 4 weeks' time, hopefully. Now, we also asked people a whole load of fixed questions, and several of these show type differences. You've seen one of these already. That question, I'm more anxious than usual. So several of those show type differences, especially with extroversion, introversion, and thinking and feeling. And I think that knowing what these type differences is and knowing how other people are coping with different ways with the COVID pandemic, perhaps what oneself is, can help us to help other people cope with what's going on at the moment. So if you look at this graph, for example, what you see there is a number of questions along the bottom, and each of these questions, like the question you answered yourself on anxiety in a polar area, you answer that question on a scale from strongly disagree up to agree. And what we're going to look is the average score, if you will, for extroverts and the average score for introverts. Now, any guesses looking at those words, looking at those themes, any guesses as to which of those people with a preference for extroversion might be more likely to endorse, and which of those people with a preference for introversion might be more likely to endorse? Any guesses? I can see Louise doing a handy thing with her hands. Yeah, because I have indeed arranged the scores so that the scores towards the left-hand side are more likely to be appreciated and endorsed by people with an introversion preference, and the scores on the right-hand side, hopefully as you're looking at the screen, are more likely to be endorsed by people with an extroversion preference. But I think it's useful to look at the absolute values here as well. So if you look at, I'm enjoying the peace and quiet of working from home, for example. People with an introversion preference definitely agree with it, but it's not that people with an extroversion preference disagree with it, they're just less likely to agree with it than people with an introversion preference. But just a bit less likely to agree with it, but they still don't disagree with it. Let's look at those scores towards the right-hand side. I miss having people around me. Life is too quiet now. And that one at where it says, I miss having people around me, this is an example of where type combinations, and it's not just about extroversion, introversion, because there's a little bit of a thinking feeling in there as well. And if we look at the way that people with preferences for extroversion answer that question, it doesn't make that much difference whether you have a thinking preference or feeling preference. That's quite similar. But people with a preference for introversion are much less likely to say, I miss having people around me. And people with a thinking preference are more likely to, or less likely to endorse that question for the people with feeling preference within the introvert group. And I have preferences, as you can see from my picture on the slide, for INTP. And it is, I'm afraid, people with preferences for INTP who are the least likely to agree with that question. Only 28% of INTPs agreed or strongly agreed with the question. 72% disagreed or strongly disagreed. And I think for people like me, that's, you know, a lesson that people are different to what I am, and that people out there may be finding the COVID pandemic rather different to deal with than I am. ESFP is the type which is most likely to say, I miss having people around me. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here because there are only 14 people who were remote workers in the data with ESFP preferences, but every single one of those either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement. No one disagreed. And I think this is a reminder that we all have different needs, and especially when we become stressed, because as we know, when we become stressed, we start to rely more and more on our favorite process and dominant function, and it's less easy to appreciate that other people are coming from a different place. There are also a number of sensing intuition differences, a number of judging and perceiving differences, but actually thinking and feeling shows the greatest level of differences for most differences. So we can see that people with a preference for thinking are more likely than people with preference for feeling to say, I appreciate working from home, and are also more likely to say they're happily using virtual apps, things like Zoom. Virtual apps like Skype and Zoom and Microsoft Teams are very useful, and that they have all the equipment and tech they need. Whereas people with a feeling preference are a little bit more likely to say, I think I'm becoming too isolated, I'm finding it difficult to concentrate, I wish I didn't have to work from home, I find it difficult to remain focused, and I feel guilty, but I still have a job. And I think that last one, I feel guilty, but I still have a job, that I think is an interesting one, because I think that links into something that Group 1 mentioned earlier. And the question we actually asked in our survey was, I feel guilty, but I still have a job when others have been laid off or furloughed. And people had to answer that question on that scale from strongly disagree through strongly agree. Now, I'm not going to ask you for your answers, but do think for a second about how you would answer that question. And this is what we found in our data. 31% of the total group either agreed or strongly agreed, so nearly a third. And for comparison, we also asked the question, I'm annoyed or angry that I'm still working when others have been laid off or furloughed, and over 5% agreed with that statement. But there's a very definite type difference. 21% of those with a thinking preference agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, but 41% of those with feeling preference. But data also suggests that this survivor guilt is increasing over time. People who completed the survey back in April were significantly less likely to feel guilty than people who completed the survey in September. That survivor guilt seems to be building, and if and when things return to something approximating normality, that accumulated guilt is unlikely to suddenly vanish. And if we think about the personality difference, one thing it's worthwhile reflecting on is that managers and executives are far more likely to have a thinking than a feeling personality preference. That's what the data says. And therefore, they may be less prone to survivor guilt themselves. And to some extent, the survey results were a little bit of a wake-up call for me personally, because respondents with ITP preferences were the least likely to experience survivor guilt, and therefore maybe the least likely to notice it in others. And this, I think, is an example where tools like the MBTI, where knowledge of type can give managers a useful framework to better understand how they differ from others, and how their employees may not see the world in the same way that they do. And I know some of you are involved with people coming back into the workplace after furlough. And I think findings like this are really useful in looking at the different sorts of feelings that people might be frustrating as they're put back in the workplace when people, other people have been there for a longer time. Let me just pause there and ask if you've got any questions about what we've been talking about so far.
I make a comment that retired people that I've talked to, and I know in myself, we feel guilty that we're having life so easy compared with so many other people.
And I think that's a really useful point. Now, one of the things that we didn't have enough retired people in our sample, we need to say that, but I can see that these same sort of survivor guilt, maybe there are those feelings that I could be doing more, I should be doing more, what can I do? I'm not doing anything, especially perhaps for those who have a feeling preference. Yeah. Any other questions or comments so far? Yes, Ruth.
Well, you see, as also a retired person, but having a thinking preference, I don't feel guilty.
Thank you for bringing the results to live with real people there for both of you.
I feel thankful, and I want to do what I can to help those who are still, you know, who don't have all the privileges that I have. But I don't feel guilty. Sorry.
And it's interesting, and yeah, and it's fun, and you know, why should you feel guilty? As I said, it would be interesting to have a large group of retired people in our sample. We didn't have that, unfortunately, and that would be interesting to actually look at the results for. Similarly, we don't really have enough people who have been on furlough to go with any data. It's really the comparison between people who are still working remotely versus people who are working still in an office setting that we have in our data. Now, we're still working through the numbers on this. But for those of you who want to find out more, there is, please do feel free to make note of that URL, and you'll see it on the recording. There is a page on the Myers Company website, which has a lot of different content on things you've already found out about remote working and working in a pandemic and how people are coping in the pandemic. So do feel free to dip into any of those materials. They're all, I'm saying this as a member of a commercial, someone who's employed by a commercial organization, they're all free. So do download them, have a look at them, and as and when we get the research reports, we're going to put those on that part of the website as well. Okay. Any questions? So we could probably talk for all day about the results of these, but I did promise I'd look at some other things as well. So what I'm going to go on to do now is to go on to one of the possible consequences of the pandemic, which is redundancy. So one effect of COVID is already for many organizations, many redundancies. And some of those people will be thinking of going it alone or starting their own business. And I guess the question is, what advice can we offer these people? And does knowing your type actually help with that? So let me ask you to just do a very quick exercise. If you'd like to raise your hand, please. If you'd consider yourself to be self-employed, or you were self-employed before you retired, for those of you who are retired. So some of you, yeah, several of you. And put your hand down now, please, and raise it if you founded your own business, if you say you founded your own business. Okay, some of you. And it's interesting for those of you who are self-employed individual consultants, where, you know, I think you probably have effectively started your own business. Now, leading up to the pandemic, there'd been an increase in the UK about the number of people who saw themselves as self-employed, rising, and these are government figures from the Office of National Statistics, rising from 3.2 million in 2000 up to 5 million in 2019. I think it's anybody's guess what the figures will be like post-pandemic, but it's likely that there are people out there at least considering those things. So for those of you who have been self-employed, or for those of you who might have been thinking of it, why would people consider going it alone? Why would you consider going alone? Or if you did form your own company, why did you go it alone? Those of you who did start your own business or were self-employed, let's hear from you. Why did you go it alone? What was the spur?
Redundancy.
Redundancy, okay. So why go it alone rather than try to get another job?
Because I wanted to do something that I didn't expect I'd get employed for, which was coaching.
Okay. Anybody else? Catherine?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just having the choice of when I worked, how much I worked. I mean, I did have young children at the time, so that worked from that point of view, but also it wasn't just about the family. It was also about choosing what work I wanted to do and not feeling, having freedom really and independence, not having to do things in a certain way.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah.
David?
Yeah. Creativity, control, choice, those kinds of things.
Okay. And it's interesting listening to your answers, because those are the sorts of things that we found in another research service a couple of years ago that people came up with. So this idea of having independence and autonomy Being your own boss was the most common thing that people mentioned. But also, some people said it's about having money, it's about supporting my lifestyle, it's about financial security. And in terms of that particular option, people with a judging preference were more likely to mention that than people with receiving preference. Or perhaps some people saw an opportunity, saw an opening, saw a gap in the market, something that they could do. And people with preferences for extraversion and intuition were more likely than those with preference for introversion or sensing to mention that reason. Or perhaps it's just something about the really intrinsic interest of the stuff they're doing. And again, people with introversion and feeling were more likely than those of extroversion or thinking to mention that idea of the intrinsic interest. Other people mentioned to make a difference, to work ethically, to have a better work-life balance, to be more creative, to go to consultancy, various other reasons. But these are the sorts of things that people came up with. And if we look at how personality type relates to whether or not people became entrepreneurs, whether people who did found, own and run their own business, within our sample, 37% were entrepreneurs, people who had started up their own business, 63% were not. And if we look at each type pair, you can see that there wasn't a great deal of difference for EI or TF, but people were much more likely to have started their own business if they had preferences for intuition, much less likely if I had preference for sensing, and again, more likely to start their own business if they had preferences for perceiving. And in terms of whole type, it was ENFP, ENTP, and INFP who were most likely to become entrepreneurs, ESFJ and ESFP the least likely. But if there are people out there who want to become entrepreneurs or want to start their own business at this current time, how can we actually help those people? Well, one of the things we asked people was, what attributes contributed to your success? For those of you who are running your own business, what stuff about you has helped you to make you more successful? And you can see on the slide here, some of the things which came out generally for people. So being creative, having contacts and interpersonal skills, being hard work and conscientious, etc. These are things that across the board people felt were important. But again, there were personality differences. So for example, people with preferences for INFP and INTP were particularly likely to mention being creative and innovative and open to ideas, and felt that was an advantage, a gift they brought to the party. People with preferences for ESFJ and ENFP were particularly likely to say they had contacts and were able to bring interpersonal skills to bear, and networks and socially confident. And people with preferences for ISFJ were particularly likely to say they like detail, they were focused on doing it right and having quality, they were diligent, they were conscientious, they were organized. And we also, of course, asked people, what about you made success less likely? The top one there was being distractible, easily bored, not methodical, etc. by some distance. But again, there were personality differences. So, for example, ESTP and ENTP were particularly like to say, yeah, I am distractible, I get bored, I don't like admin. ISTP were particularly like to say, I really don't like selling and marketing, I don't think I'm very good at marketing and selling myself. People with preference for ESFJ, more likely to say, I tend to be a bit overconfident, I do things too quickly, I'm a bit headstrong in the way I do things. I'm touching very quickly on this, but what we're able to do across all of this data was to produce what we've called type tips for entrepreneurs. Now, unless you've got a big screen, you almost certainly can't actually read that stuff, but you can see the screen at the moment, but worry not, because help is at hand. So if you go to the Myers-Briggs Company website and click on the bar you'll see at the top right hand side saying Knowledge Center, then click on where it says Practitioner Resources and type entrepreneur into the search box, you'll be able to download those type tips for entrepreneurs yourself. And hopefully you'll find those useful for working with people, if you have coaching clients, others who are thinking about, in the current circumstance, start their own business, or maybe for those of you who are already working independently, you might find some of those useful to reflect on as well. And here is a research report as well. Now, the reality of the situation is that many people may not be able to start their own business but may find that they start undertaking what's being called gig work. The analogy here, and a somewhat romantic picture on the slide there, is that these are people who go from job to job, like a musician goes from gig to gig. And these are people who work on a freelance basis, carry out short-term jobs or contracts, but not necessarily fixed to a single employer. Employers tend to see these people as self-employed, like Uber drivers, for example. But there have been, I'm sure you're aware, many legal cases where some of these people have been recognised as actually employed by organisation. However you define these people, they are an increasing proportion of the workforce and are likely to be an even larger part of the workforce post-COVID. They're not all called gig workers. You may hear people called gig workers or contingent workers or freelancers or contractors. But the key thing there is actually most odd low-paid hourly workers. And they're somewhere in that ground between entrepreneurs who start their own business and people who are doing this work from gig to gig. And again, we have some research on those. There's not time to look in detail on that today, but again, just to say that there are some type tips for gig workers as well, which again, you can download from our website. I'm conscious I've raced through that a little bit, just because I want to make sure we cover all the ground. Let me just pause there and ask if you've got any questions about what we've been talking about so far. So I have been probably filling your brains with lots of content. And what sometimes happens when your brain's been filled with lots of content is you'll feel the need for a short break. Come back, everybody. Welcome back to the session. So let me just talk through what's going to happen for the rest. Oops, let me just change my screen so I can see what's going on. What's going to happen for the second part of our session. So we've been through really two areas, those COVID-19 research and the piece of entrepreneurs. We're going to finish off by looking at the always-on culture and what that might mean for people. And also finish off on a more positive note by looking at how we can promote well-being at work. So that's the plan for the rest of the time, and we'll be about another 30 minutes. Hopefully that's fine for everybody. Excellent. So let's talk about the always-on culture. And by the always-on culture, what I mean is the idea that we can be always connected because we have things like this. Services and information are available to us 24/7, which is a lovely thing, but it does mean it can be quite difficult for people to switch off and disconnect and relax and take themselves away from that information. We know from other research that that can increase the sort of interference between our working life and our home life, and that can cause stress. And that it can be both empowering and enslaving. So on the one hand, you can be empowered. If you want to get that information or contact somebody at any hour of the day or night, you can do that. But it can be enslaving as well. Just because you can't do it, perhaps you feel you have to do it. So what we wanted to do was to carry out some research. This is done by my colleague Nikita Blackburn last year, into the always-on culture, to look at what the impact of being connected was always being connected on things like productivity and how that differed between personality types, and especially what strategies can people use to minimize those downsides of always being connected. So we carried out another survey and we had a little over 1,000 people who took part. And one of the things we found was that those people who were able to access their working emails or calls outside of work, there were some positive aspects. They reported greater work engagement, greater engagement for work, and greater job satisfaction, but there were actually quite a few negative things as well. They reported more difficulty to switching off. They said they were more distracted. They said there was greater conflict between work and home, and they did find themselves compulsively checking their devices a lot more of the time. And that difficulty switching off in turn led to high levels of job stress and interference between work and home life. And that compulsive checking meant they were more distracted and found it more difficult to focus on work or home activities. So in that sense, the always on culture is very much a sort of double-edged sword. So thinking about that, what do you think some of the advantages or the disadvantages of the always on culture might be? Anybody like to shout out some advantages? What are good things about this idea of always being connected? Perhaps there aren't. Any advantages? Sorry.
Flexibility.
Flexibility, yeah.
And not missing something.
Flexibility and not missing something, yeah. Anything else? Any other advantages?
I think opportunity to make money is a lot easier because I manage loads of influencers and they make a lot of money right now.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are new opportunities to do all sorts of things, including making money.
You can catch problems quicker and fix things.
Yeah, you can catch and hopefully fix problems more quickly.
I can do things when I want to do them.
You have, yeah. So tie in really, I think, to what Chris was saying, is that flexibility of when you do things and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So lots of advantages to the always on culture. And these are some of the things that people said in our survey in order of the percentage of the group who mentioned them. So things like, I'm going to read them because some of the writing might be a bit small depending on your screen size, being kept in the loop, being able to respond quickly to things, having that flexibility, as you said, of where and when you work, being accessible to others if you need it, to keep on top of work tasks, and so on. But interestingly, 10% of the group said there are no advantages. Some people said, no, there are no advantages to the always on culture. What about the disadvantages? What are the disadvantages of this always on culture? What are the less good things? Anybody?
Well, I was looking at that one that was shown as a positive, accessible to others, and I think that can be a disadvantage.
Yeah. So being accessible to others is one thing, but being continually accessible to others and pulled in all directions is something else. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure, especially on social media, to keep up with what they think they're seeing. Yeah.
So for your influencers in particular, there's that constant sort of guinea pig wheel going on there.
Also, John, the expectation that you will always be available.
Yeah, so the expectation, not only can you be available, but you're expected to always be available. Any other day or night, you're going to be able to respond.
So you're balancing work-life balance.
Yes, the balance of work-life balance. And these are some of those disadvantages that were mentioned by the group. You can't switch off, you're always on in that sense. It interferes with your family life and your personal life, perhaps. You can become mentally exhausted by it. You're expected to always be available. It can cause health problems. You're distracted. You're expected to respond quickly, and so on and so forth. And although 10% of the group said there are no advantages, only about 3% of the group said there are no disadvantages. And if you look at the size of those bars that are on the same scale on the chart in front of you, you can see more people thought of disadvantages than thought of advantages. And if we look at some of the things that people actually said, this is an example of one of the advantages of always on. This is a quote from someone in the survey. One of the advantages was, I never miss anything. I don't mind working outside the office because I like to live and breathe what I do. On the other hand, this is something that was mentioned as a disadvantage. You burn out, you have no private life, you've got no time for your children, you're going to have regrets at the end of your life, you end up in all these tense situations, you lose friends, you lose close relationships. I have to say that Nikita, who did this work and was coding all this data, did feel herself quite depressed at the end of having to go through all this stuff. And she did have to take a few breaks from it because there were quite a few of these more sort of negative things coming out. So what sort of things contribute to that stress, to that always on stress? Well, what we did in our research was we worked out a sort of overall stress score, which is job stress plus difficulty switching off plus scores on that conflict. And we found that lots of individual things contributed to that stress. But in terms of the most important things, the single most important thing, and for those of you who like stats, this was done by regression analysis, the single most important thing was organizational culture. If you were in an organization which had the expectation that you would be always on, which didn't allow you to say, no, those are my hours, I'm not going to assign it, that was the single biggest contributor to always on stress. Followed by employment type. People who were self-employed reported considerably less always on stress than people who were employed full-time. People who employ part-time, sort of in the middle. Sensing intuition in terms of the MBTI personality type, we'll come back to that in a moment. Job level. So there's been other research into stress which says that sometimes people at high levels are actually less stressed because they have more control. In terms of this always-on stress, we found that generally speaking, the higher you were up in the hierarchy, the more always-on stress you had. And the number of people in your organization.
John?
Yes.
To what extent, given organizational culture pushing it to be always on, can developing better boundaries help with that?
I think it can help with it to a great deal, and hold that thought because we'll come back to that in just a little while. That's one of, I think, the main learning points from this. The organizations can do a lot themselves to alleviate that always-on culture, or to mitigate the effects of that always-on culture. There were some personality differences. So, for example, people with a preference for extroversion were more likely than those with a preference for introversion to have a work smartphone or laptop, so we're more connectable, which in itself can be a source of stress. People with preference for introversion and with preference for sensing had a greater desire to keep work and home life separate. And if they weren't able to do that, again, that could be stressful. People with a preference for judging were more likely to have a work smartphone and more likely to have higher job-related stress. People with a preference for sensing reported greater always-on stress and lower levels of job satisfaction. So these people were particularly stressed by the always-on culture, which goes back to what we were looking at in the previous slide. And there were some people in the survey who said, no, I never feel always on. I'm always fine. I just deal with stuff. It's great. It's fine. Give me it. And all of those people had preferences for intuition and perceiving. So we can see there were personality differences, and that's interesting. But perhaps the most important thing is, what can you actually do? What can people actually do to mitigate the effects of the always-on culture? And what we did do was ask people what were their strategies to cope with the always-on culture. This, as you see in the slide, may not be the most useful strategy. In practice, people had somewhat different strategies. So, for example, a chunk of people just avoided technology use. They turned off their devices when they didn't want to use them. They put them somewhere where they wouldn't have to interact with them. One person put their work smartphone in the fridge outside of working hours, for example, because they wouldn't hear it because it's a nice insulated box. Or just not accepting to have that work kit. Again, this was done before the COVID pandemic, and things, I guess, may have changed a little bit now. Just try to keep work and home life as separate as possible. So having a sort of time boxing, where you keep time for this and time for that, and really be quite forceful about that. Setting boundaries of yourself, having separate work and home kit, choosing where you can, who you work for. Being thoughtful about how you communicate with others, setting boundaries with other people about when you can be communicated to, what about, doing things like only sending emails during business hours, only responding outside of hours to the most important work issues, doing other things to take yourself away from always on, absorbing activities, or just being careful about yourself, or taking holidays, and just being really quite mindful and choiceful about the way you used technology. And what we did find were there were some personality related issues. So if you think about extraversion-introversion, that can give people the key as to what's going to work for them in terms of making the time and space to switch off and take yourself away from the always-on culture using those absorbing activities. Sensing and intuition, we know, is about the way people prefer to take in information. So making sure that you don't get to absorb all the detail of all this stuff is coming in, and take a step back if you have a sensing preference, or making sure you only do one thing at a time if you have a preference for intuition. Thinking and feeling, really useful to think about how you form boundaries with other people. So if you have a thinking preference, we know from other research into using email, for example, that people with thinking preference don't always think about the fact that they may be interrupting others with emails, or they may be sending emails at less considerate times. So considering the impact of you being always on other people and making sure you do that if you're thinking preference, and with people with feeling preference, thinking, actually, do I have to respond right now? How important is it for that person? Making time for yourself and having, and not being everybody's beck and call. And for judging and perceiving, finding a form of work-life balance that suits you. For judging, really being quite careful about setting those boundaries. And for perceiving, people perceiving preference typically have less boundaries people work at home. They can have a tendency to send people emails or other communications all hours of the day and night because it's when they're working. But just thinking about how that's going to affect other people and doing things like queuing up emails to send in the morning, even though they may be thinking of things at some more opportune moment in the middle of the night. And in terms of the more general things that apply to everybody, some things we found were important for everybody, although the way you do this might depend on your personality. And really key three things, and this goes back, I think, to your question before, Chris. First of all, for both the individual and the organization, to make sure there are opportunities to switch off. For the individual, finding ways to mentally switch off from work, from emails, from social media technology on a regular basis. And for organizations, and we saw from the data that organizations which didn't allow people to switch off really stressed people out. Organizations thinking about creating a culture that allows people to switch off from work in their free time, but doesn't enforce people to communicate at all hours of the day or night. Setting boundaries with yourself, and for the organization, setting clear expectations about the way technology can be used both inside and outside of work. And again, this may be more complicated by the fact that more people are now working at home, but it's still, I think, really important. In fact, more important. And last but not least, thinking about how you communicate, setting boundaries with others and letting people know when you can be communicated to, when you can work. So many people now, for example, are working reduced hours in different organizations because of financial reasons or because of issues around furlough. Making sure they stick to those, and for the organization, allowing them to stick to those. And I think one of the key things for leaders in organizations, and this is one really important thing, is that they are prepared to role model that behavior. So that leaders don't think of themselves as so busy and so important, that they are part of the always on culture, because if they're modeling that always on behavior, that's going to be a reason for their staff to model that behavior as well. Now, you can again go to the Myers-Briggs Company website, you get a research report on this, as well as not quite the same sort of type tips, but some type-based advice, which looks at each of these areas and goes through what I've just talked about in more detail for individual type preference pairs, as well as for those general points for organizations as well. Okay, let me pause there for a moment. I'll just see if anyone has any questions about that.
Could I ask John if there's any differentiation with the age group of the people in the study, people in their 20s or 30s, and whether there was a difference?
My honest answer is I can't remember because this bit of research was last year. However, if you download a research study, I know we did look at age in there, so you can find out the answer there.
Okay.
And I can, and if not, my email is on the last. My email address is on the last slide here. So just drop me an email if there's anything specific you want to find out. Drop me the email, and I'll send relevant information on to you.
Thank you.
Any other questions about the always on culture? I think again, this is my opinion rather than backed up by data. But these things about the always on culture, I think, are even more important now, because when you're working from home, it's easier to be pulled into that into the always on culture. It can be more difficult to adopt those boundaries. And I think that's something that probably all of us have become aware of over time. What we've tended to find is that people with a judging preference were initially more disturbed by suddenly having to work from home, but got into a routine. People perceiving preference, there's a little bit of more danger that they'll be pulled into doing things at more convenient times for them, but not necessarily more convenient times for other people. Okay, so we've spent most of our time looking at some of the more negative issues around some of the things we've been looking at. Let's finish off by looking at something a little bit more positive, looking at well-being at work. Now, before I start defining what well-being is in terms of what we're looking at, and whether or not this guy on the slide has experienced well-being, I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I'm not going to ask you to say anything out loud. All I'd like you to do is reflect on your answers to each question. And you can write your answers down if you want to, but you don't have to. Now, these questions are phrased in a work-related way, so if you're no longer working, do feel free to think about your answer in a non-work context. So here's the first question. I'd like you to think of the last situation where you felt sustained positive emotion at work, or I guess outside of work. So joyfulness, cheerfulness, happiness, etc. How does this affect your work, or how did it affect what you were doing at the time? Okay, just think about your answers to that for a moment. The next question, think of a person you have a positive relationship with at work, or perhaps in another context. What about that relationship or about that person makes it positive for you? Think of a time when you thoroughly enjoyed a work activity that used your strengths, that used your talents. What did that feel like? What was that like for you? Think of a role or an activity that you undertook at work or in another context that really gives you a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. How does that help you? How did it help other people? Think of something you do that gives you a sense of achievement at work. How does that achievement make you feel? And last, but in some ways least, when did you last have a strong negative emotion at work or in some other context, like anger or depression or anxiety or being dejected? And how did that affect your work? Okay. Everyone had a chance to think of some things that they thought of for those. Okay. Now, the reason I ask you those questions is that each of those maps onto a different aspect of well-being. What we've done is create a model of well-being based on the work of Martin Seligman, whose picture you can see on the slide there, which we call the PREMAN model. So if we look at each of those 6 factors, the first one, positive emotions, is about having frequent feelings of happiness, contentment, and pleasure. And the first question I asked you concerns this aspect of well-being. The second question is about having mutual feelings of caring, support, and satisfaction of others. Then engagement is about having a deep psychological connection and absorption in an activity or a cause. So that's the third question. Meaning is about, well, having meaning, having a sense of purpose and direction, which is why I asked you this question. Accomplishment is about pursuing success or mastery for its own sake. And last, negative emotions is about having anxiety, being pessimistic, or being depressed. So that then is the PREMAN model. And what we did is we've carried out a survey. We surveyed actually between 2016 and 2018, nearly 1,000 adults. And we didn't just ask them those questions, we asked them a more structured questionnaire which reflected those scales. We measured each of those scales and we looked at overall well-being on a scale from 1 to 10. And the good news is, across the whole group, overall well-being was pretty high, 7.5 on a scale from 1 to 10. There's a bit of variation between the other scales, with relationships being given the highest average rating. The low score there for negative emotion, the right-hand side there, suggests that most people don't frequently experience negative emotions at work, although the slightly below average score for positive emotions might mean that positive feelings like optimism, contentment, happiness, satisfaction are experienced less often at least at work than other aspects of well-being. So that's the rank order of the PREMAN factors, from relationships down to negative emotion. And this is a rank order for each type. The order is actually very similar across the different types. And again, there's a report you can download on this from a website. So most have relationships as the top one, except INTJ, ENTJ, and ESTJ, which have a slightly different order. INTJ putting accomplishment and then meaning, ESTJ and ENTJ putting meaning at the top. Let's look at some differences in well-being. Let's look at gender. Do you think there'll be differences in terms of gender? Do you think those differences will be male or female? Who's going to have the highest level of well-being, men or women? Votes for men? A few of you. Votes for women? A couple of you. Okay. What we actually found in practice is that there was no significant difference in overall being, but women were slightly higher on engagement and positive emotions. What about age? Do we think older people would show more well-being on the whole, on average, or younger people? Votes for older? Quite a few of you. Votes for younger? Think anyone's voting for younger? Some people are abstaining? Yeah, well-being tends to go up steadily by age, and that reflects other research. And we also found some differences by region as well, although those weren't huge between the people in Australasia and Latin America, according to our data, coming out the highest on well-being. Now, what we also found is that overall well-being varies by type. And I'm not going to ask you to shout out, but just think for a second what types you think might show, on average, the highest levels and the lower levels of well-being. The most obvious effect is that introverts tend to have lower levels of well-being than extroverts. On average, every introverted type is lower than every extroverted type. In particular, ISTP is the lowest type, and ESTP and ENTP the highest. And the individual well-being scales follow a similar pattern. So we are seeing these differences by type, but they're not huge, and they're all above 7 on our 1 to 10 scale. Because it's important that people are working in the context of organizations, we also want to look at what was in it for the organization. To persuade organizations, it's good to look at for the well-being of their staff. So in the 2018 version of the survey, we asked questions about organizational outcomes, and we found that people with high levels of well-being said they were less likely to intend to leave the organization, less likely to be looking for a new job, less likely to say they felt they only were staying in the organization because they had to, had higher levels of job satisfaction, felt a greater attachment to the organization, and also exhibited more organizational citizenship behaviors. And by organizational citizenship behaviors, these are things which are about being a good citizen. Behaviors that aren't explicitly rewarded by things like salary or part of your job, but have the organization function properly. These can be things which are directed at the individual, things like being kind, being courteous, altruism to other people in the organization, and things directed at the organization, things like being conscientious, doing the right thing, doing your duty. But let's think about perhaps how we can enhance well-being at work. And exercise may be one way, I guess, but our question is, what can you do at work to enhance workplace well-being? and what can you do outside of work to enhance workplace well-being? So you think about people's level of well-being in the workplace. What can we do at work to make that bigger? And what can we do outside of work to actually increase their workplace well-being as well? And what I'm going to do is we'll be taken away into some groups in a moment, and we're going to give you just, I think, because we're a little short of time now, just 5 minutes to come up with activities you can think people could do at work to enhance their workplace well-being, and things people could do outside of work. Okay, one. You again, Catherine, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because I said, oh, I did it last time. I don't want to do it this time. So somebody else said, oh, I did it last time as well. I don't want to do it. And then the other said, oh, I didn't write anything down.
Okay, so what can you do at work?
At work, we thought it was harder at work. Anyway, at work, we mainly talked about having breaks from your work, either with other people to talk about non-work stuff or not with other people. And we also talked about if something's gone wrong at work, then doing something you enjoy and that you're good at to get you sort of mentally back on track.
Yeah.
Do you want and then the outside work, we had a whole list, you know, we had going for walks, seeing friends to build your emotional resources, healthy eating. And we also had a discussion about the difference between something where, like a walk where you might still be absorbed, you might be sort of still thinking things, which is fine if that helps you switch off. Distinction between that and doing an activity like something with your dog or playing tennis or whatever, when you're completely in the moment and you're not in your head at all.
So things that take you absolutely away from it versus things that help you to process it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Group 2, anything to add to that? Or a spokesperson?
Oh. It was in group 2.
We didn't get around to having a spokesperson, but the two things I think we felt enhanced well-being at work were one, being valued and appreciated, which I guess if you're not, maybe it's difficult to know quite what you can do about that. But the other is finding meaning in work. I think we felt those two things came through strongly. I'm not sure, would somebody else like to say something about enhancing well-being outside work?
If you didn't get time to do that, that's fine. The other group, anything to add to those things you've heard so far?
Well, we talked about things that make the employee feel valued, and somebody said boundaries, having clear boundaries about what were people's role and their time boundaries as well.
Okay.
We took ages to get going because we were such a mixed type group.
So for the first exercise, sorry, go ahead.
Also the importance of developing the relationships at work.
Yes.
Makes you want to be there so you can be with those people.
Yeah. Now, for the first exercise, I put you in type and I groups. For this one, I mixed you up just to see how it would work. So it was interesting. It was you had a different sort of discussion. These are the things that came out from the survey in terms of the top 5 across the board. So focus on work and tasks that interest you. Focus on a task that makes you feel positive. Take on work where you learn something new. Take breaks where needed. Take on challenging work that adds to your skills and knowledge. Very much for some of the things that you were talking about. One interesting thing, which isn't in this slide, but for those people who already had average or above levels of well-being, the single most important thing was just going to work. So once you're in a place where you enjoy your work, just going to work has this sort of virtuous spiral, it would seem. Outside of work, yeah, the sort of things you talked about, spending time with family or friends, music, reading, focus on the positives in life, exercise, play sports, or go for walks. Now that perhaps is a little bit anodyne. I thought, was the whole presentation maybe 45 minutes, in which case I'm way over, but I'm nearly there.
No, mine is coming up at 1.
Okay. So what we do have again is a research report. You can download that from a website. I'm directing lots of people to the website today, but what that does have on it are well-being tips for each type. Yeah, so we'll have that more detailed information for each type as well. So everything I've talked through today on well-being is on the website. So we've talked through really those 4 different studies. The COVID study, which is ongoing, the entrepreneurs and gig workers, the always on culture and well-being at work. Hopefully it's been interesting, hopefully it's been useful. And I think although the world is, very much a complicated place, hopefully there's some hints and tips in here about how we could use our knowledge of type to make things just a little bit better, perhaps for ourselves, perhaps for people we work with, or with people we deal with in life. Thanks for your time. If you'd like to get in touch or want copies of anything we've talked about or reports you can't find on the website, just drop me an email at that email address. I'm very happy to answer it for you. Other than that, I think hopefully we have a little bit of time for any questions that you might have. So over to you.